The September afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the vicarage lawn where St. Mary Mead had assembled for its annual harvest fete. Bunting fluttered between the ancient elm trees, and the scent of Mrs. Bantry's prize-winning roses mingled with the aroma of freshly baked scones from the tea tent. Children darted between the stalls, while their mothers negotiated the delicate social minefield of the flower arrangement competition, and the vicar attempted to look impartial about the competing merits of jam versus marmalade. Miss Jane Marple had positioned herself strategically beneath the horse-chestnut tree, her knitting resting in her lap, while her keen blue eyes observed the familiar tableau of village life. She had learned long ago that people revealed their truest selves when they believed themselves unobserved, and a village fete provided an excellent opportunity for such observation. Today, however, something felt subtly amiss, though she could not immediately identify the source of her unease. Her attention was drawn repeatedly to Blackwood House, the imposing Victorian residence that stood at the bend of Church Lane, partially obscured by a stand of ancient yews. The house had been home to Mrs. Eleanor Vance for the past 3 years, ever since she had arrived from London following her husband's sudden death. Mrs. Vance was a woman of considerable means and impeccable taste. Her generous contributions to village life, including the restoration of the church organ and the new pavilion for the cricket club. Yet despite her philanthropy, she remained something of an enigma, often observed at her drawing-room window, a solitary figure gazing out at the world she had chosen to join, but never quite seemed to inhabit. The villagers had taken to calling her the widow at the window, a sobriquet that captured both her habitual position and her air of perpetual observation. She attended church services and village functions with appropriate regularity, but there was always a sense that she was performing a role rather than living it naturally. Miss Marple had noticed the way Mrs. Vance's smile never quite reached her eyes, and how her conversations, though perfectly pleasant, revealed nothing of substance about her inner thoughts or feelings. This afternoon, Mrs. Vance had been expected to officially open the new children's reading corner in the village hall, a project she had funded entirely from her own resources. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock, and Miss Marple noticed that several villagers were beginning to glance toward the hall entrance with increasing frequency. Mrs. Carmichael, the self-appointed coordinator of village social events, was consulting her watch with visible agitation. "I do hope Mrs. Vance hasn't forgotten," she confided to Miss Marple as she hurried past with an armful of ribbon. "She's usually so punctual about these things. Perhaps someone should check on her." Before Miss Marple could respond, the peaceful afternoon was shattered by the sound of breaking glass, sharp and unmistakable, coming from the direction of Blackwood House. A collective pause fell over the fete as heads turned toward the sound, followed by the more disturbing noise of something heavy falling. Young Tommy Bond, who had been playing cricket with several other boys on the strip of grass beside the lane, stood frozen with his bat in hand. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, his face pale with guilt. "The ball went right through her window." Dr. Haydock, who had been judging the vegetable marrow competition, immediately set down his clipboard and began walking briskly toward Blackwood House. Miss Marple rose from her chair with surprising agility, her instincts telling her that this was more than a simple accident. Several other villagers began to follow, drawn by curiosity and concern. The front door of Blackwood House stood slightly ajar, which was unusual for Mrs. Vance, who was known for her attention to security. Dr. Haydock knocked firmly and called out, receiving no response. After a moment's hesitation, he pushed the door open and stepped inside, with Miss Marple and several others close behind. The drawing room, where Mrs. Vance spent so many hours at her window, was in disarray. The large bay window that faced the village had a jagged hole in its center pane, with glass scattered across the Persian carpet. The cricket ball lay near the fireplace, but it was not the ball that drew their attention. Mrs. Eleanor Vance sat in her usual chair, positioned at the perfect angle to observe the village activities, but her observation days had come to an end. She was dressed in her finest afternoon dress, as though prepared for the ceremony she would never attend. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her expression was peaceful, almost serene, but her eyes, which had watched so much from this very window, would watch no more. Dr. Haydock approached cautiously, his professional instincts taking over. After a brief examination, he straightened with a grave expression. "I'm afraid Mrs. Vance is dead," he announced quietly. "It appears to be natural causes, but given the circumstances, we'll need to notify the authorities." Miss Marple stood quietly in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The broken window, the scattered glass, the cricket ball, and most importantly, the perfectly positioned chair, and the woman who had made watching others her life's occupation. Something about the scene troubled her, though she could not yet articulate what it was. In her experience, when things appeared too perfectly arranged, they usually were. The widow at the window had become the subject of observation herself, and Miss Marple suspected this was only the beginning of a very complex story indeed. Within minutes of Dr. Haydock's grim pronouncement, the news rippled through the harvest fete like a stone cast into still water. The cheerful bunting continued to flutter in the September breeze, but the laughter had died away, replaced by urgent whispers and sideways glances. Mrs. Carmichael, her face flushed with the peculiar importance that tragedy brings to its first witnesses, had appointed herself chief messenger of the news. "Natural causes," Dr. Haydock says, she announced to anyone within earshot, though her tone suggested she found this explanation somehow inadequate. Such a shock, sitting there in her chair as peaceful as you please, as if she'd simply dozed off watching us all. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham within the hour, his motor car raising dust clouds that settled like a pall over the remaining fete stalls. He was a man of decisive action and limited patience, particularly when dealing with what appeared to be a straightforward case of elderly demise, complicated only by coincidental timing. After a brisk consultation with Dr. Haydock and a cursory examination of the scene, he emerged from Blackwood House with his notebook already closing. "Mrs. Eleanor Vance, aged 62, appears to have died of natural causes," he announced to the assembled villagers. "The broken window is unfortunate timing, nothing more." His stern gaze fell upon young Tommy Bond, who shrank behind his mother's protective bulk. Boys need to learn proper places for their cricket games. Dr. Haydock, however, had taken pains to reassure the distressed child. "Listen carefully, Tommy," he said, resting a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Mrs. Vance was already dead when your ball broke that window. You've done nothing wrong, lad." The doctor's words provided some comfort, but they also raised questions that Inspector Slack seemed disinclined to pursue. If Mrs. Vance had died before the window broke, what had caused that heavy falling sound they'd all heard? Mrs. Finch, Mrs. Vance's daily help, arrived in a state of considerable agitation, having caught the early bus back from her sister's birthday celebration in East Down. She was a small, spare woman whose devotion to routine was legendary throughout the village. "Left everything just so, I did," she declared to Inspector Slack, her keys jangling with indignation. "Doors bolted, windows fastened, except for the little top light in the scullery, and the best china laid out ready for the ceremony. Mrs. Vance was particular about security, she was. Never left so much as a window catch undone." This testimony prompted a frown from Inspector Slack, who had noted the front door standing ajar. When pressed, Mrs. Finch grew more emphatic. "Locked up tight as a drum when I left at noon, Inspector. Mrs. Vance always checked behind me, made sure everything was secure, had a proper fear of burglars, she did." The villagers, meanwhile, had begun constructing their own theories with the enthusiasm typical of St. Mary Mead when presented with a puzzle. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to let facts interfere with a good story, had already decided that Mrs. Vance's mysterious London past held the key to everything. All that money, and nobody knowing where it came from, she confided to Miss Weatherby. "I heard there were questions about her husband's business dealings before he died. Something about missing company funds." Colonel Bantry, examining his pocket watch with military precision, offered a different perspective. Solitary life, big empty house, no family to speak of. These things take their toll on a person's constitution. Probably had a weak heart and never mentioned it. His wife Dolly nodded agreement, though Miss Marple noticed she seemed more intrigued than sorrowful. She did keep herself to herself, didn't she? Always at that window, watching but never really participating. One wondered what she was thinking about. The vicar attempted to restore some dignity to the proceedings. "Mrs. Vance was a generous benefactor to our community," he reminded the gathering. "Only last week she spoke of establishing a scholarship fund for village children. We should remember her kindness, not speculate about her private affairs." Miss Marple listened to these various observations with careful attention, her knitting forgotten in her lap. What struck her most forcefully was not what people were saying, but what they were not saying. Several villagers seemed notably quiet about Mrs. Vance's death, their expressions thoughtful rather than shocked, as if they were not entirely surprised by this turn of events. She found herself particularly interested in Mrs. Finch's testimony about the locked house. If Mrs. Vance had been so security-conscious, how had someone gained entry? And why had the front door been found ajar? The broken window provided an obvious explanation, but the timing troubled her. Dr. Haydock had been quite clear that Mrs. Vance died before the cricket ball struck the glass. As the fete gradually disbanded and villagers drifted home to their tea tables, Miss Marple remained beneath the horse-chestnut tree, her sharp eyes fixed on Blackwood House. The widow at the window had finally drawn the villagers' complete attention, but Miss Marple suspected this was only the beginning of a far more complex story than the morning following Mrs. Vance's death dawned with the peculiar hush that settles over a village when tragedy has interrupted its routine. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and after tending to her garden and feeding the sparrows that gathered expectantly at her kitchen window, she found herself drawn once again toward Blackwood House. The boarded window gave the elegant Victorian facade a wounded appearance that seemed to reflect the village's collective unease. She was not surprised to encounter Mrs. Finch at the garden gate, clutching her familiar basket of cleaning supplies and wearing the determined expression of someone who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with shock and duty. The daily help had clearly resolved to set things right, though her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with her keys. "I've come to put the house in order," Mrs. Finch announced, though her voice carried an underlying tremor. "Can't leave things all topsy-turvy, not with Mrs. Vance always being so particular about everything being just so." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, noting how the woman's grief manifested itself in an almost frantic need for normalcy. "Such a shock for you, finding her like that. You knew her habits better than anyone, I imagine." 3 years I worked for her, every day except Sundays," Mrs. Finch replied, her voice gaining strength as she spoke of familiar routines. Regular as clockwork she was, always dressed proper by 9, correspondence in the morning, then her position at the window after lunch. She paused, her expression troubled. "That's what bothers me, Miss Marple. She never had her afternoon tea yesterday." This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. Mrs. Vance had been a woman of rigid habits, yet she had died before partaking of her customary 3:30 Earl Grey. Always at the same time. Never varied, not once in 3 years. Royal Worcester cup, 2 digestive biscuits, Earl Grey with 2 lumps, though she said it was wicked indulgence. Mrs. Finch's voice grew more agitated. "But yesterday the tray was still in the kitchen, kettlestone cold, everything laid out proper but never used." As they spoke, Dr. Haydock approached from the direction of the vicarage, his medical bag in hand and his expression thoughtful. After exchanging pleasantries, he drew Miss Marple aside while Mrs. Finch disappeared into the house with her cleaning supplies. "I've been thinking about yesterday's events," he began without preamble. Medically speaking, there's nothing to contradict natural causes, but something troubles me. Mrs. Vance consulted me regularly about minor ailments, but her heart was sound. She had no history of cardiac problems, and she was the type to mention any symptoms. Miss Marple absorbed this information carefully. The timing seems unusual as well. Mrs. Finch says she died before her afternoon tea. Yes, sometime between lunch and 3:30, I'd estimate. What puzzles me is how composed she appeared. Sudden cardiac events typically leave some sign of distress, but she was sitting peacefully, hands folded, almost as if she'd arranged herself deliberately. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. James Latimer, a thin, precise solicitor from Much Benham who carried himself with the careful dignity of one accustomed to handling other people's secrets. He nodded politely before explaining his business. "I've come to secure Mrs. Vance's papers. As her legal representative, I must ensure her affairs are properly managed." She was quite methodical about documentation. "You handled all her legal matters?" Miss Marple inquired with gentle curiosity. "Indeed. She consulted me when she first arrived, regarding the house purchase and various other arrangements. Very organized woman, strong opinions about how her estate should be managed." Mr. Latimer adjusted his briefcase with the air of someone who had revealed more than intended. "But I shouldn't discuss details until formalities are completed." Shortly after the solicitor entered the house, Mr. Julian West, the church organist, appeared with the aggrieved expression of someone whose carefully laid plans had been disrupted by inconvenient mortality. He was a delicate man with artistic sensibilities and an obvious appreciation for Mrs. Vance's patronage. "I had an appointment yesterday at 2 o'clock, he explained to Miss Marple. "We were to finalize the recital program and discuss the organ fund. She was very particular about musical standards." His fine eyes softened with what appeared to be genuine regret. A discerning patron, though some thought her influence excessive in village matters. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this hint of discord. There were those who disagreed with her involvement. Mr. West hesitated, glancing toward the house. "One hears remarks. Last week I saw her speaking rather sharply with a young woman in a green coat at the garden gate. They seemed to be having words, though I passed on without listening, naturally." After the organist departed, Miss Marple walked slowly around the house, ostensibly admiring the late roses, but actually observing details that others might miss. Through the drawing-room window, she could see where Mrs. Vance's chair had been positioned. The carpet showed faint indentations where the chair legs usually rested, but yesterday it had been moved slightly forward, closer to the window. On the polished floor beside the chair, she noticed a small scuff mark that could have been made by a shoe or something being dragged. Returning home, Miss Marple settled in her garden with her knitting, but her mind was far from peaceful domestic concerns. The accumulating inconsistencies troubled her. A security-conscious woman found with her door unlocked, rigid habits abandoned on the day of an important ceremony, a composed death that suggested preparation rather than surprise. Most intriguingly, Mrs. Vance had been a woman who spent her days observing others, and Miss Marple wondered what secrets those careful eyes might have discovered during their vigilant watch over St. Mary Mead's daily dramas. Inspector Slack's tidy conclusion suggested. Inspector Slack returned to St. Mary Mead the following morning with the purposeful stride of a man determined to transform an inconvenient death into a tidy case file. His investigation, conducted with characteristic efficiency, had already identified what he considered a perfectly adequate suspect in the person of Clara Jenkins, a young woman whose public quarrel with Mrs. Vance the day before her death provided both motive and opportunity in Inspector Slack's orderly mind. Clara worked part-time at the village post office and lived in a modest cottage with her ailing grandmother, whose property bordered the extensive grounds of Blackwood House. The argument, witnessed by several villagers outside Hartwell's bakery, had concerned a promised donation that Mrs. Vance had mysteriously withdrawn at the last moment. The funds were intended to help Clara's younger brother attend art school in London, a dream that had been crushed by Mrs. Vance's sudden change of heart. She promised faithfully, Clara had explained to Inspector Slack, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. Said she admired artistic talent and wanted to help young people achieve their potential. Then, without any explanation, she sent word that the funds were otherwise allocated. It was cruel, Inspector, particularly when she knew how much it meant to our family. Inspector Slack found Clara's alibi disappointingly weak. She claimed to have been home caring for her grandmother during the crucial afternoon hours, but the elderly woman's deafness and tendency toward afternoon naps made her an unreliable witness. More damning still was Clara's admission that she had walked past Blackwood House twice that afternoon, ostensibly on errands to the chemist, but Inspector Slack saw these as reconnaissance missions for a planned confrontation. The case seemed admirably straightforward to Inspector Slack's practical mind. A young woman, desperate to secure her brother's future, had been publicly humiliated by a wealthy widow's capricious withdrawal of support. In a moment of passion, she had confronted Mrs. Vance, perhaps intending only to plead her case, but the encounter had escalated tragically. Dr. Haydock's insistence on natural causes merely confirmed that the death had resulted from shock or exertion rather than direct violence, which made the crime no less real in Inspector Slack's estimation. Miss Marple, however, found herself profoundly unconvinced by this neat solution. She had observed Clara Jenkins throughout her childhood and young adulthood, noting the girl's fierce loyalty to her family and her passionate sense of justice. While Clara certainly possessed a volatile temper, it was the anger of frustration and indignation, not the cold calculation required for deliberate harm. Moreover, Miss Marple had noticed Clara's hands during their brief conversation the previous evening. Clean, unscratched, with no signs of the physical struggle one might expect from a violent confrontation. Her doubts were further reinforced by the arrival of Robert Vance, Mrs. Vance's nephew from London, who appeared at the Blue Boar Inn with the practiced grief of someone accustomed to managing family crises. A well-dressed man in his early 30s, he spoke eloquently of his aunt's generosity while his eyes calculated the probable value of her estate. His timing struck Miss Marple as remarkably convenient, arriving mere hours after the death of an aunt he claimed to have visited rarely, but corresponded with regularly. "Aunt Eleanor was always so interested in my business ventures," he confided to Mrs. Carmichael, who had positioned herself strategically in the inn's front parlor. "She often spoke of wanting to help me establish a proper firm once her affairs were settled. Such a tragedy that her plans will never come to fruition." Miss Marple noted the presumptuous tone of someone who had already counted his inheritance before it was officially confirmed. She also observed that Robert Vance seemed remarkably well informed about his aunt's financial situation for someone who claimed their relationship had been maintained primarily through correspondence. The mystery deepened further when Mrs. Finch, still shaken by the previous day's events, confided to Miss Marple about certain irregularities she had noticed in Mrs. Vance's recent behavior. The normally punctual widow had begun receiving frequent telephone calls at odd hours, conversations conducted in hushed tones behind the closed door of her study. Additionally, Mrs. Finch had observed her employer making detailed notes about various villagers' activities, particularly their financial circumstances, and any recent improvements to their properties or lifestyles. She kept asking questions about who had new motor cars, who had made alterations to their houses, who seemed to be living beyond their apparent means. Mrs. Finch explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I thought it was just natural curiosity, but looking back it seemed more systematic, like she was conducting some sort of investigation." This revelation cast Mrs. Vance's 3 years of careful observation in an entirely different light. Rather than the idle curiosity of a lonely widow, her window watching had been purposeful surveillance. Her generous contributions to village life suddenly appeared less philanthropic than strategic, positioning her at the center of community activities where she could observe and gather information about everyone's affairs. Miss Marple recalled Mr. Latimer's mention of Mrs. Vance's methodical approach to documentation and wondered what secrets those careful records might contain. She also remembered the solicitor's nervous demeanor when discussing his client's affairs, suggesting there were aspects of Mrs. Vance's business he preferred not to examine too closely. As Inspector Slack prepared to formally charge Clara Jenkins with causing death by misadventure, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the accumulating inconsistencies. The crime scene's undisturbed perfection, Mrs. Vance's composed final position, the unlocked front door despite her security obsessions, and the systematic nature of her recent activities all pointed toward a more complex truth than Inspector Slack's hasty conclusion could accommodate. The widow at the window had indeed been watching, but Miss Marple suspected she had seen something that made her a target rather than merely an observer. In her experience, those who made it their business to uncover others' secrets rarely died peacefully in their chairs, and she was beginning to fear that Mrs. Vance's final observation had been her last. The third morning after Mrs. Vance's death brought with it a clarity that had been absent from the previous days of speculation and hasty conclusions. Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to Blackwood House, ostensibly to deliver a jar of her homemade gooseberry preserve to Mrs. Finch, but in truth compelled by a growing certainty that something fundamental had been overlooked in the rush to assign blame to poor Clara Jenkins. The drawing-room, where Mrs. Vance had spent her final afternoon, had been restored to its customary order by Mrs. Finch's diligent hands. The broken window was now covered with a neat square of plywood, casting the room in a subdued, almost reverent light. The chair where the widow had been discovered sat beneath its protective dust sheet, but Miss Marple could still envision the scene exactly as she had first observed it. Mrs. Vance, positioned with perfect composure, hands folded, face turned toward the window as if she had simply dozed off while watching the harvest fate unfold below. It was this very perfection that troubled Miss Marple most deeply. In her extensive experience with human nature, she had observed that death, particularly sudden death, rarely arranged itself so tidily. People experiencing cardiac distress did not typically fold their hands with such precision or maintain such serene expressions. They certainly did not position themselves at optimal viewing angles while suffering the confusion and panic that accompanied medical emergencies. Mrs. Finch, grateful for both the preserve and the companionship, was eager to discuss her employer's habits with someone who showed genuine interest rather than Inspector Slack's impatient efficiency. Mrs. Vance was particular about everything having its proper place, she explained, carefully dusting the small inlaid table that stood beside the widow's chair, her spectacles especially. Never left them lying about carelessly. Either they were on her nose for reading or watching, or folded neatly on this very table when she was finished. Never anywhere else, not in 3 years of service. Miss Marple's attention sharpened considerably. And where exactly were her spectacles found yesterday afternoon? Mrs. Finch paused in her dusting, a small frown creasing her weathered features. That struck me as odd at the time, though I didn't like to question the inspector's judgment. They weren't on the table where they belonged. He found them tucked into the pocket of her afternoon dress, folded neat as you please. Said it showed her tidy nature, even in her final moments. This revelation struck Miss Marple with the force of genuine enlightenment. Mrs. Vance had been notorious throughout St. Mary Mead for her afternoon vigils at the drawing-room window. The entire village had grown accustomed to seeing her silhouette there, watching their comings and goings with the systematic attention of a dedicated observer. Her eyesight had been notably poor, requiring strong spectacles for both reading and distance vision. The idea that she would remove these essential aids to observation, fold them carefully, and tuck them into her dress pocket while supposedly engaged in her customary window watching was not merely unlikely, it was impossible. The implications were profound and disturbing. Someone had taken considerable care to arrange Mrs. Vance's body in a manner consistent with her daily routine, creating the impression of a peaceful natural death during her habitual observation period. The attention to detail had been meticulous, from the selection of her finest afternoon dress to the precise positioning of her hands. But the spectacles represented a crucial oversight, revealing the artificial nature of the entire scene. Miss Marple requested permission to examine Mrs. Vance's writing desk, where she discovered additional evidence supporting her growing suspicions. The leather-bound blotter showed faint impressions from recent correspondence, and by angling it toward the window light, she could make out fragments of what appeared to be appointment notations. The partial words Tuesday 2:30 were clearly visible, along with what looked like initials that had been pressed through from the paper above. Mrs. Finch confirmed that Mrs. Vance had indeed been expecting visitors on the day of her death. Mr. West was to come at 2:30 about the organ recital, and she mentioned having another appointment later in the afternoon. She seemed rather anxious about it, kept checking the clock and adjusting her appearance, not like her usual calm self at all. The picture that emerged was far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward narrative of confrontation and tragic consequence. Mrs. Vance had been conducting business from her window perch, receiving visitors and maintaining extensive correspondence about matters that had made someone desperate enough to risk murder. The killer had possessed both the sophistication to plan an elaborate deception and the intimate knowledge of Mrs. Vance's habits necessary to arrange a convincing scene. Most significantly, the murderer had been someone Mrs. Vance trusted sufficiently to admit to her carefully secured house. The unlocked front door, which had puzzled everyone, now made perfect sense. She had opened it herself for someone she considered safe, someone who had then exploited that trust to arrange her death and stage the aftermath with cold-blooded calculation. As Miss Marple walked home through the golden afternoon light, she reflected on the cruel irony that Mrs. Vance's final observation had likely been of her own killer. The widow at the window, who had made watching others her life's occupation, had been deceived by someone skilled enough to turn her greatest strength, her attention to detail, into the instrument of her destruction. The spectacles tucked so carefully into that dress pocket represented more than mere evidence of staging. They were a testament to the killer's arrogance, a belief that such a small detail would pass unnoticed among the larger drama of death and accusation. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that murder, however cleverly planned, invariably revealed itself through just such overlooked particulars. The game, as she was fond of observing, was now truly afoot. Miss Marple's investigation began in earnest the following morning with a visit to the post office, where Mrs. Kirby presided over both the mail and the village's small telephone exchange with the efficiency of someone who understood that information was the true currency of rural life. A small purchase of stamps and a gentle inquiry about the difficulty of managing calls for elderly residents was all the encouragement Mrs. Kirby needed to share what she'd observed. Mrs. Vance had more telephone calls these past weeks than anyone in the village, Mrs. Kirby confided, consulting the small notebook she claimed was merely to aid her memory. London numbers mostly, including a Mayfair exchange and another from the city. On the day of the fete, she received 2 calls in the morning, one from that Mayfair number at 10:10 and another from Mr. Latimer's office just after 11. Miss Marple absorbed this information with careful attention. And in the afternoon. That's what struck me as odd. Miss Nolan from the Blue Boar rang through at 1:30, asking if Mrs. Vance would be at home after 2. I connected the call, but there were no more after that, which was unusual for her recent pattern. The mention of Miss Nolan intrigued Miss Marple considerably. Ivy Nolan was a young woman whose smart green coat had been much admired at the fete, and whose position at the inn provided her with access to information about the various London visitors who had been frequenting the Blue Boar in recent weeks. Later that morning, Mr. Latimer arrived at Miss Marple's cottage gate with the harried expression of a man whose professional discretion was warring with his conscience. After accepting tea and ensuring they would not be overheard, He unburdened himself of knowledge that had clearly been weighing heavily upon him. Mrs. Vance was not the philanthropic widow she appeared to be, he began reluctantly. Her late husband's business dealings were questionable at best, involving investment schemes that left several prominent families considerably poor. She inherited not only his wealth, but also certain documents that implicated various individuals in fraudulent activities. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. And she was using this information for what she called contributions to village causes. The organ fund, the cricket pavilion, the reading corner, all financed through systematic blackmail. She kept meticulous records of her targets, their vulnerabilities, and the amounts she extracted from each. The solicitor's hands trembled as he continued. When I arrived to secure her papers, I discovered that several files were missing. Someone had gained access to her records and removed specific evidence with considerable care. The filing cabinet showed signs of hasty but methodical searching. This revelation cast Mrs. Vance's window watching in an entirely different light. Her systematic observation had been far from idle curiosity. It was intelligence gathering for a sophisticated extortion operation. The recent telephone calls, the detailed notes about villagers' financial circumstances, the withdrawn promises to Clara Jenkins, all now made perfect sense as part of a calculated strategy. Miss Marple's afternoon was spent in seemingly casual conversations that revealed the extent of Mrs. Vance's operations. Clara Jenkins, still shaken by Inspector Slack's accusations, confided additional details about her final interactions with the widow. She didn't just withdraw the art school funding, Clara explained, her voice barely above a whisper. She had promised to help with grandmother's cottage repairs, then suddenly changed her mind. She said something about reconsidering charitable allocations and hinted that some villagers weren't as deserving as they appeared. It felt like a threat. More significantly, Clara revealed having witnessed a heated argument between Mrs. Vance and her nephew Robert just days before the death. He seemed very agitated. I heard him mention something about ruining everything and going to the police. Mrs. Vance just stood there looking stern, then went inside and shut the door firmly. This information cast Robert Vance's convenient arrival and calculated grief in a new light. His urgent requests for loans, documented in his aunt's correspondence, suggested financial difficulties that contradicted his confident demeanor. If Mrs. Vance had been threatening to expose his own questionable dealings, his motive became considerably stronger than mere inheritance. Mr. Julian West, the church organist, revealed Mrs. Vance's controlling nature during their final meeting. She insisted on vetting every piece of music for the recital and showed peculiar interest in my students' family circumstances. She asked intrusive questions about their parents' professions and financial situations. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had systematically gathered information on the entire village, building what amounted to a comprehensive dossier of secrets and vulnerabilities. Her generous contributions had been strategic investments, positioning her at the center of community activities where she could observe and collect intelligence. Most intriguingly, the mystery of the green coat began to resolve itself. Miss Marple had noticed the garment hanging in the church vestry, too elegant for any of the regular parishioners. When she mentioned this to Mrs. Kirby, the postmistress confirmed that Ivy Nolan had been seen wearing such a coat, though the girl claimed to have purchased it second-hand in Much Benham. The accumulating evidence suggested that Mrs. Vance's death was not the result of a spontaneous confrontation, but a carefully planned elimination by someone who understood both her methods and her vulnerabilities. The missing files indicated that the killer had specific knowledge of what evidence needed to be destroyed, pointing to either a long-term victim of her blackmail or someone with legitimate access to her private papers. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the cruel irony of Mrs. Vance's situation. The widow at the window had become so successful at uncovering others' secrets that she had made herself indispensable to maintain and ultimately too dangerous to allow to live. The fourth day after Mrs. Vance's death brought an unexpected visitor to St. Mary Mead in the form of Miss Emily Davies, a small, sharp-eyed woman who introduced herself as a distant cousin of the deceased. Her arrival at the Blue Boar Inn created ripples of fresh gossip, particularly when she began speaking candidly about her late relative's character over a deliberately public lunch in the inn's dining room. Eleanor was always calculating, even as a girl, Miss Davies declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. She had a talent for discovering people's weaknesses and turning them to her advantage. My own family lost considerable money in her husband's business ventures, and Eleanor's promises to make amends always came with conditions that served her interests more than ours. Her revelations prompted a curious shift in village sentiment, as residents began to recall instances of Mrs. Vance's manipulative generosity with uncomfortable clarity. Mrs. Price Ridley suddenly remembered the strings attached to a small loan she had accepted, while Colonel Bantry admitted that his wife's gratitude for Mrs. Vance's restoration of their valuable painting had come at the cost of certain social obligations they had previously dismissed as mere courtesy. However, the most significant development came not from Miss Davies's testimony, but from an entirely unexpected source. Young Lily Bond, Tommy's older sister, had returned from her position as parlour maid at a Kent estate, having travelled home on urgent family business related to her brother's distress over the broken window incident. Miss Marple encountered her near the village green, where Lily was clearly wrestling with information she felt compelled to share. "I wasn't supposed to be in the village that day, Miss Marple," Lily confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had developed a terrible toothache while at my position, and Mrs. Henderson sent me home on the early bus to see Dr. Haydock. I arrived just before noon and walked past Blackwood House on my way to the surgery." What Lily had observed cast an entirely different light on the established timeline of events. "I saw Mr. Latimer leaving Mrs. Vance's house, carrying a small leather case. He looked terribly flustered and kept glancing about as if he hoped no one would notice him. When he saw me, he seemed quite startled and hurried away toward his motor car." This revelation was particularly damaging because Mr. Latimer had claimed to have arrived at Blackwood House only after Mrs. Vance's body was discovered, and he had certainly made no mention of any earlier visit. His presence there hours before the official discovery of the death, combined with his obvious discomfort at being observed, suggested a level of involvement far beyond simple legal representation. Miss Marple recalled Mr. Latimer's nervous demeanor when discussing Mrs. Vance's affairs and his curious emphasis on the missing files from her study. If he had been present at the house before the body was found, he would have had ample opportunity to remove any documents that might implicate him or reveal the full extent of Mrs. Vance's blackmail operations. The picture that emerged was far more complex than Inspector Slack's theories could accommodate. Mrs. Vance had clearly been conducting systematic extortion, using her window watching not merely for idle observation, but as intelligence gathering for a sophisticated operation that extended well beyond St. Mary Mead's boundaries. Her meticulous preparations for her final afternoon, including the selection of her finest jewelry and the arrangement of documents on her desk, suggested she had been expecting a crucial confrontation rather than a routine social visit. The missing files that Mr. Latimer had reported took on sinister significance in light of Lily's testimony. His intimate knowledge of Mrs. Vance's filing system, combined with his legal expertise in document management, would have made him uniquely capable of identifying and removing specific evidence while leaving the scene otherwise undisturbed. Miss Marple also reflected on the curious detail of Mrs. Vance's spectacles found folded in her dress pocket despite her habitual afternoon window watching. The killer had taken care to stage a convincing scene of natural death, but had overlooked this crucial inconsistency that revealed the artificial nature of the entire arrangement. The village's eager acceptance of Clara Jenkins as the obvious suspect now appeared to be exactly what the true killer had intended. By creating a narrative of youthful rage and tragic consequence, the murderer had deflected attention from the more calculated crime that had actually taken place. The unlocked front door, previously puzzling given Mrs. Vance's security consciousness, now made perfect sense if she had admitted someone she trusted implicitly. Mr. Latimer's position as Mrs. Vance's legal advisor would have given him access to all her secrets, including the identities of her blackmail victims and the evidence she held against them, if he had been embezzling from client accounts or engaged in other professional misconduct. Mrs. Vance's threats to expose him would have meant not merely financial ruin, but criminal prosecution and professional disgrace. As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on how the widow at the window had finally become the subject of observation rather than its agent. The killer had counted on the village's tendency to accept obvious explanations and their reluctance to suspect someone of professional standing and apparent respectability. The game, Miss Marple realized, was entering its most dangerous phase, where a cornered killer might strike again to protect their carefully constructed deception. The methodical mind that had planned Mrs. Vance's death with such attention to detail would not hesitate to eliminate additional threats to their security, and Miss Marple suspected that Lily Bond's innocent testimony had just made the girl a target. The weight of Lily Bond's testimony about Mr. Latimer's undisclosed presence at Blackwood House settled heavily on Miss Marple's mind as she contemplated the dangerous game now unfolding in St. Mary Mead. She had observed enough of human nature to recognize that cornered individuals, particularly those with reputations to protect, often became most dangerous when their carefully constructed facades began to crumble. The methodical mind that had planned Mrs. Vance's death with such meticulous attention to detail would not hesitate to eliminate additional threats, and Miss Marple feared that young Lily's innocent revelation had marked her as a target. Her concerns proved well-founded when she learned that Lily had failed to return home the previous evening, having supposedly gone to visit a friend in Much Benham. Mrs. Bond's growing anxiety was palpable as she confided to Miss Marple that her daughter had been unusually nervous since sharing her testimony, jumping at unexpected sounds and repeatedly asking whether she had done the right thing in speaking up about what she had witnessed. Miss Marple understood that the time for passive observation was drawing to a close. Inspector Slack's determination to charge Clara Jenkins with causing death by misadventure represented a dangerous miscarriage of justice that would leave the real killer free to strike again. She needed to force the murderer's hand to create a situation where their guilt would reveal itself through reaction rather than evidence, since the physical proof had been so carefully manipulated or destroyed. The opportunity presented itself when Mr. Latimer arrived at her cottage gate that afternoon, ostensibly to inquire about certain household items that Mrs. Vance had mentioned bequeathing to village friends. His manner was professionally cordial, but Miss Marple detected an underlying tension in his precise movements and carefully modulated voice. She invited him in for tea, noting how his eyes quickly surveyed her sitting room as if cataloguing potential threats or escape routes. As she prepared the tea service with deliberate care, Miss Marple began her subtle interrogation, disguising her probing questions as innocent village gossip. "Such a shock about poor Mrs. Vance," she began, settling into her chair with her knitting. "Mrs. Finch was telling me how particular she was about her daily routines. Even her spectacles, always folded neatly on the table beside her chair when she wasn't using them. Never anywhere else," she said. She watched Latimer's reaction carefully as she continued. "The inspector found them tucked into her dress pocket, which struck me as rather odd, given that she was supposedly engaged in her afternoon window watching when she passed away. One would expect her to be wearing them, wouldn't one?" Latimer's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. "Perhaps she had finished her observations for the day," he suggested, his voice carrying a forced casualness, "or was simply resting her eyes before the ceremony." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this explanation. Possibly. But then there was the matter of the unlocked front door. Mrs. Finch was quite emphatic that Mrs. Vance never left it unbolted, yet it was found standing ajar, Dr. Haydock confirmed that she died before young Tommy's cricket ball broke the window, so the impact couldn't have dislodged the latch. The solicitor's composure began to show hairline cracks. His fingers drummed nervously against his briefcase, and a thin sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead despite the cool afternoon. The shock of her final moments, perhaps. People don't always behave predictably when experiencing cardiac distress. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed gently, though one wonders how someone experiencing such distress would have the presence of mind to remove her spectacles, fold them carefully, and tuck them away so neatly. It suggests a level of deliberate preparation that seems inconsistent with sudden medical emergency. She paused to pour more tea, using the silence to observe Latimer's increasing agitation. His professional mask was slipping, revealing the desperate calculation of someone whose carefully constructed alibi was being systematically dismantled by an elderly woman's seemingly innocent observations. And then there were those missing files from her study, Miss Marple continued conversationally. Inspector Slack mentioned that someone had removed specific documents with considerable care and knowledge of her filing system. It would require intimate familiarity with her affairs to know precisely which papers to take, wouldn't it? Latimer's control finally snapped. He set down his teacup with a sharp click, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Miss Marple, I find your implications highly inappropriate. I'm a respected member of the legal profession, and I will not sit here while you suggest— I'm merely observing inconsistencies that trouble me, Miss Marple replied with unruffled calm. Young Lily Bond mentioned seeing you leaving Mrs. Vance's house much earlier than you initially indicated to Inspector Slack. She said you appeared quite flustered and were carrying a leather document case. The color drained from Latimer's face as he realized the full implications of what Lily had witnessed. His careful timeline, which had placed him safely away from Blackwood House during the crucial hours, had been completely destroyed by the testimony of an innocent girl who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. That girl is mistaken, he said stiffly, rising abruptly from his chair. I arrived only after receiving word of Mrs. Vance's death, as I told the inspector. Miss Marple's keen blue eyes never left his face. How unfortunate that Lily isn't here to clarify her recollection. I do hope nothing has happened to her. Young people can be so vulnerable when they possess information that others might find inconvenient. The threat in her words was unmistakable, and Latimer's reaction confirmed her worst fears. His face went ashen, and she saw the flash of panic in his eyes as he realized that his secret had been exposed not only to Miss Marple, but potentially to others as well. The careful killer who had staged Mrs. Vance's death so meticulously was now facing the prospect of complete exposure, and Miss Marple knew that desperate men were capable of desperate actions. As Latimer hurried from her cottage without the usual pleasantries, Miss Marple reached for her telephone. The game had entered its most dangerous phase, and she feared that time was running short to prevent another tragedy in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's telephone call to Inspector Slack proved more persuasive than she had anticipated, particularly when she mentioned Lily Bond's disappearance in connection with her testimony about Mr. Latimer's undisclosed visit to Blackwood House. The inspector's professional instincts, however grudging, recognized the potential danger to a witness, and within the hour his motorcar was once again raising dust clouds along the village lanes. The search for Lily took on desperate urgency as darkness began to settle over St. Mary Mead. Dr. Haydock joined the effort, his medical authority lending weight to Miss Marple's concerns, and together they systematically checked every possible hiding place within the village boundaries. Miss Marple's intimate knowledge of local geography proved invaluable, directing their attention to the abandoned gamekeeper's cottage on the far edge of the Vance property, a structure that Mr. Latimer would have known about through his legal work on the estate. They found Lily bound and gagged in the cottage's single upstairs room, terrified but mercifully unharmed. Her rescue revealed the full extent of Latimer's desperation and his willingness to silence inconvenient witnesses through kidnapping. And worse, the girl's tearful account of her ordeal confirmed Miss Marple's worst fears about the solicitor's capacity for violence when cornered. "He seemed so respectable when he approached me," Lily whispered, still shaking from her experience. "Said there had been a misunderstanding about what I saw, and he wanted to help me remember more accurately. But once we reached this place, everything changed. He became cold, methodical, talking about permanent solutions to witness problems." Inspector Slack's skepticism finally crumbled in the face of this evidence. A kidnapping connected to witness testimony about a suspicious death could no longer be dismissed as village gossip or elderly imagination. He immediately dispatched constables to locate Mr. Latimer, while Miss Marple insisted on gathering the remaining suspects at Blackwood House for a proper resolution of the mystery. By 9 o'clock that evening, the drawing room where Mrs. Vance had spent her final afternoon hosted an unlikely assembly. Dr. Haydock sat beside the boarded window, his medical bag at his feet. Mrs. Finch perched nervously on the edge of a chair, her loyalty to her deceased employer warring with her growing understanding of the woman's true nature. Clara Jenkins attended with visible relief, sensing that her ordeal as chief suspect was nearing its end. Robert Vance lounged with studied casualness, though his eyes betrayed anxiety about his inheritance prospects. Julian West smoothed his cuffs with nervous precision, while Ivy Nolan twisted the belt of her smart green coat. Miss Marple positioned herself beside the fireplace, her knitting resting in her lap as she began the methodical revelation that would expose 3 years of carefully hidden truths. "We have been asked to admire a picture that was altogether too perfect," she began in her mild voice that had so often proved deceptively sharp. "When a scene appears too carefully arranged, one must ask who did the arranging and why." She gestured toward the chair where Mrs. Vance had been discovered. The widow at the window was not watching the fete when she died. Her spectacles, essential for both reading and distance vision, were found folded neatly in her dress pocket. A woman whose life revolved around observation would never have removed them while supposedly engaged in her afternoon surveillance. This detail alone proves that her death was staged to appear natural and coincidental. Inspector Slack leaned forward, his notebook ready. But Dr. Haydock confirmed natural causes. No signs of violence or struggle. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "But natural causes can be induced by those who understand human psychology and vulnerability. Mrs. Vance was not the philanthropic widow she appeared to be. She was a systematic blackmailer, using her window watching to gather intelligence and her generous contributions to position herself at the center of village life where she could collect secrets and exploit weaknesses." The revelation sent ripples of shock through the assembled group. Mrs. Finch gasped audibly, while Robert Vance's studied nonchalance slipped considerably. Miss Marple continued her explanation with relentless precision. Her late husband's business dealings provided the foundation for her operations, but she had expanded far beyond his original schemes. The missing files from her study were not random theft, but careful selection by someone who knew exactly which documents posed the greatest threat. Someone with intimate knowledge of her filing system and legal training in document management. She paused, allowing the implications to settle before delivering her conclusion. Mr. Latimer killed Mrs. Vance not in a moment of passion, but through calculated psychological manipulation. He arrived for their afternoon appointment knowing that exposure meant professional ruin and criminal prosecution. When Mrs. Vance refused his final plea for mercy and reached for her telephone to contact the authorities, he revealed the full extent of his desperation in terms designed to induce fatal shock in a woman already under considerable stress. The drawing room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple's gentle voice continued to weave the threads of evidence into an unbreakable pattern of guilt, each detail supporting the next in the methodical revelation that had made her reputation throughout the villages of England. Miss Marple allowed the weight of her accusation to settle over the drawing room before continuing with the methodical precision that had characterized her investigation. The assembled villagers sat in stunned silence, absorbing the revelation that their respected solicitor had committed murder through psychological manipulation rather than physical violence. The method was both sophisticated and cruel, she explained, her knitting needles clicking softly as she spoke. Mr. Latimer understood that Mrs. Vance's greatest fear was not death, but public disgrace. Her entire blackmail operation depended on maintaining her reputation as a philanthropic widow while secretly exploiting others' vulnerabilities. He used this knowledge as a weapon. Inspector Slack leaned forward, his skepticism finally giving way to professional interest. "But how can you prove psychological murder, Miss Marple? There's no physical evidence of violence." "The evidence lies in the staging itself," she replied calmly. Mrs. Vance died clutching her chest in natural response to cardiac shock, but someone then carefully arranged her body to suggest peaceful death during routine observation. Her spectacles were removed and folded into her dress pocket, her hands positioned with deliberate precision, her chair angled toward the window to complete the illusion. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "The medical signs were consistent with sudden cardiac failure, but I did note the unusually peaceful appearance. Patients experiencing fatal heart attacks typically show considerable distress." Miss Marple gestured toward the small table beside Mrs. Vance's chair. "The timing proves premeditation." Mrs. Finch confirmed that her employer never varied from her afternoon routine. Tea at 3:30, positioned at this window with spectacles firmly in place. Yet the tea tray remained untouched in the kitchen, and she died before her customary surveillance began. This was not coincidental timing, but calculated murder during a private appointment. Clara Jenkins sagged with visible relief, understanding finally that her ordeal as chief suspect was ending. Robert Vance shifted uncomfortably, his inheritance concerns now overshadowed by family scandal. Julian West dabbed his forehead nervously, while Mrs. Finch wept quietly into her handkerchief. "The unlocked front door puzzled everyone," Miss Marple continued, given Mrs. Vance's obsession with security. "But it makes perfect sense if she admitted someone she trusted completely. Her solicitor would have had unrestricted access, particularly for urgent legal business." She paused, observing the faces around her with sharp blue eyes. Lily Bond's testimony destroys Mr. Latimer's carefully constructed alibi. She witnessed him leaving Blackwood House at noon, carrying a document case and appearing extremely agitated. This was hours before he claimed to have first arrived in response to news of the death. Inspector Slack made rapid notes. "And the missing files?" Selected with surgical precision by someone who knew exactly which documents posed the greatest threat. Mr. Latimer's intimate knowledge of Mrs. Vance's filing system, gained through 3 years of legal representation, allowed him to identify and remove evidence of his own embezzlement while leaving the scene otherwise undisturbed. The psychological portrait that emerged was chilling in its calculation. Latimer had arrived for their appointment knowing that Mrs. Vance held proof of his theft from client accounts, money used to cover gambling debts that threatened his professional reputation. When she refused his final plea for mercy and reached for the telephone to contact the Law Society, he had revealed the full extent of his desperation. He likely told her that he had already taken steps to expose her blackmail operation, Miss Marple explained. That the authorities were being contacted, that her carefully maintained reputation would be destroyed within hours. For a woman whose entire identity depended on respectability, whose greatest terror was public humiliation, the shock was calculated to be fatal. The cruel irony was not lost on anyone present. Mrs. Vance, who had made a career of exploiting others' weaknesses, had been destroyed by someone who understood her own vulnerability with professional precision. Her systematic observation of village life had finally encountered someone whose desperation exceeded her calculating nature. As Miss Marple concluded her explanation, the sound of motor car engines announced the arrival of additional constables. Through the boarded window, they could see lights moving through the village as the search for Latimer intensified. His kidnapping of Lily Bond was the final proof of guilt. Miss Marple observed. "An innocent man does not silence witnesses through abduction." His desperation revealed the truth that careful staging had tried to conceal. Mrs. Finch looked up through her tears. "To think I worked for her all those years, never knowing what she really was. All that watching, all that careful attention to detail, it was for blackmail. She was a woman who believed she could observe without being observed," Miss Marple replied gently. "But in the end, someone was watching her just as carefully, studying her habits and vulnerabilities with the same systematic attention she brought to others' secrets." The drawing room fell silent, except for distant voices calling through the village streets as the net closed around the fugitive solicitor. The widow at the window had indeed made her final observation, but unlike her previous surveillance subjects, her killer had possessed both the desperation and the capability to silence her permanently. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with decisive finality. "We'll have him before morning, Miss Marple, and this time there'll be no convenient explanations or staged scenes to hide behind." The game that had begun with systematic blackmail and careful observation had ended with calculated murder and meticulous deception. Justice, delayed by clever staging and false alibis, was finally within reach as St. Mary Mead prepared to confront the uncomfortable truths that had festered beneath its peaceful surface. The net closed around James Latimer before dawn, not through dramatic pursuit, but through the methodical police work that his own systematic nature had made inevitable. Inspector Slack's constables found him at the abandoned railway halt beyond Much Benham, where he had been waiting for the early freight train with the desperate hope of reaching London undetected. His capture was almost anticlimactic. A tired, defeated man clutching a leather document case that contained the final evidence of his guilt. Detailed records of his embezzlement and copies of Mrs. Vance's blackmail files that he had been unable to destroy. By mid-morning, Blackwood House hosted its second gathering in as many days, this time with Latimer present under police guard. The drawing room where Mrs. Vance had spent her final afternoon now served as the stage for Miss Marple's complete exposition of the crime. Inspector Slack positioned himself near the boarded window, while Dr. Haydock occupied his familiar spot beside the fireplace. Mrs. Finch sat rigidly upright, her loyalty to her deceased employer warring with her growing horror at the revelations. Clara Jenkins attended with visible relief, finally freed from the shadow of false accusation, while Robert Vance maintained his studied nonchalance despite the obvious collapse of his inheritance expectations. Miss Marple settled into her chair with her knitting, her mild blue eyes surveying the assembled group with the same careful attention she had brought to the entire investigation. "Mr. Latimer has provided Inspector Slack with a full confession," she began gently, "though I suspect he still believes his actions were somehow justified by circumstances." Latimer, flanked by 2 constables, maintained his professional dignity even in defeat. "Mrs. Vance was a blackmailer," he said stiffly. "She destroyed lives systematically, using her position as benefactress to gather intelligence and exploit weaknesses. My only crime was refusing to be her victim." "Your crime, Mr. Latimer, was far more calculated than that," Miss Marple replied with quiet authority. "You murdered Mrs. Vance through deliberate psychological manipulation, then staged an elaborate deception to conceal your guilt. The method was both sophisticated and cruel, exploiting her greatest fear, public disgrace, as effectively as any physical weapon." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook as Miss Marple continued her methodical exposition. The evidence, when presented systematically, formed an unbreakable chain of guilt that Latimer's careful planning could not overcome. "The spectacles were your first mistake," Miss Marple explained. "Mrs. Vance never removed them during her afternoon observations, yet you folded them neatly into her dress pocket while staging the scene. This single detail proved that her death was arranged rather than natural." The grey October dawn that broke over St. Mary Mead 3 days after the dramatic confrontation brought with it the quiet satisfaction of justice served and truth revealed. James Latimer had been apprehended before midnight at the abandoned railway halt beyond Much Benham, where Inspector Slack's methodical search had cornered him like the desperate fugitive he had become. His capture was almost anticlimactic. A tired, defeated man clutching a leather document case that contained the final evidence of his systematic embezzlement and copies of Mrs. Vance's blackmail files that he had been unable to destroy. His confession, delivered with the precise language of his legal training, confirmed every detail of Miss Marple's deductions, while revealing the cold calculation behind his psychological murder. He had arrived at Blackwood House for their final appointment, knowing that exposure meant professional ruin and criminal prosecution. When Mrs. Vance refused his desperate plea for mercy and reached for her telephone to contact the Law Society, he had revealed his trump card with deliberate cruelty, that he had already taken steps to expose her blackmail operation to the authorities, that her carefully maintained reputation would be destroyed within hours, that the respectable widow would become a public scandal. For a woman whose entire identity depended on maintaining appearances, whose greatest terror was public humiliation, the shock had been precisely calculated to be fatal. After she collapsed from cardiac failure, Latimer had methodically staged the scene with the attention to detail that had characterized his legal career, positioning her body in the chair, removing and folding her spectacles, arranging her hands with deliberate precision to suggest peaceful death during routine observation. The legal proceedings moved with surprising swiftness once the full extent of Latimer's crimes became clear. His embezzlement of client funds to cover gambling debts had prompted investigations revealing a pattern of financial misconduct extending back several years. The precedent for prosecuting psychological murder required careful legal maneuvering, but Inspector Slack's methodical presentation of evidence convinced the magistrates that calculated killing remained murder regardless of method. Clara Jenkins emerged from her ordeal as chief suspect with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced false accusation and emerged with integrity intact. The village's collective guilt over her near persecution manifested in practical ways. Colonel Bantry arranged a small exhibition of her brother's artwork in Much Benham, while Dr. Haydock quietly established a scholarship fund that would enable the young man to pursue his artistic studies without the tainted assistance Mrs. Vance had promised and withdrawn. Mrs. Finch struggled most profoundly with the revelations about her employer's true nature. The knowledge that her meticulous service had unknowingly facilitated a blackmail operation shook her deeply, but Miss Marple's gentle counsel helped her understand that being deceived by skilled manipulation reflected no failing on her part. "You served faithfully and honestly," Miss Marple had reassured her. "That Mrs. Vance exploited your virtues for criminal purposes speaks to her corruption, not yours." The disposition of Mrs. Vance's estate proved as complex as her life had been secretive. Robert Vance's inheritance was substantially reduced by legal fees and compensation to his aunt's blackmail victims, many of whom finally found courage to come forward once her death removed the threat of exposure. The elegant furnishings of Blackwood House were sold to settle debts, while the house itself stood empty, its windows no longer hosting their systematic surveillance of village life. Perhaps most significantly, the community's perception of Mrs. Vance's legacy underwent profound transformation. Her generous contributions to village life, the restored church organ, the cricket pavilion, the children's reading corner, were now viewed with the uncomfortable knowledge that they had been financed through systematic extortion. These beautiful additions to St. Mary Mead served as tangible reminders that even the most polished philanthropy could conceal the darkest motivations. The psychological impact on the village had been profound, but ultimately healing. The comfortable assumption that wealth and respectability guaranteed virtue had been permanently shattered, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of human nature's capacity for both generosity and calculated cruelty. Conversations now carried an undertone of healthy wariness, but also a deeper appreciation for genuine kindness when it was encountered. As autumn deepened and the first frost touched the late roses in her garden, Miss Marple reflected on the profound irony that had characterized the case from beginning to end. Mrs. Vance, who had made systematic observation her life's work, had been destroyed by someone who understood her methods and vulnerabilities with professional precision. The widow at the window, who had spent 3 years watching others with predatory calculation, had finally encountered someone whose desperation exceeded her own manipulative skills. The ultimate lesson, Miss Marple mused as she scattered crumbs for the sparrows that gathered expectantly at her kitchen window, was that observation without compassion inevitably became mere surveillance, and that secrets, when weaponized against others, ultimately destroyed both victim and perpetrator. Mrs. Vance had possessed genuine intelligence and organizational skills that could have been channeled into legitimate philanthropy, but she had chosen exploitation over service, manipulation over genuine charity. St. Mary Mead would heal, as communities always did when truth finally emerged from shadows, but it would be a deeper, more thoughtful place for having confronted the reality that evil could hide behind the most convincing masks of respectability. The sparrows continued their cheerful morning chorus, reminding Miss Marple that life's simple pleasures remained constant despite human complications, and that wisdom often lay in distinguishing between genuine kindness and its calculated imitation. The mystery of the widow at the window was closed, but its lessons about human nature would endure long after the last autumn leaves had fallen. Dr. Haydock nodded confirmation. The medical evidence supported natural cardiac failure, but the positioning was too perfect, too composed for someone experiencing sudden distress. Miss Marple recognized what my professional focus had missed. The timing provided additional proof, Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Vance died before her customary 3:30 tea, before her afternoon surveillance period, on the very day she was to perform an important ceremony. The coincidence was too convenient, particularly given her rigid adherence to routine. Lily Bond's testimony had destroyed Latimer's carefully constructed alibi completely. Her observation of his noon departure from Blackwood House, carrying a document case and appearing extremely agitated, placed him at the scene hours before he claimed to have first arrived. The missing files from Mrs. Vance's study showed signs of selective removal by someone with intimate knowledge of her filing system and legal training in document management. The method itself was diabolical in its simplicity, Miss Marple observed. You knew Mrs. Vance's greatest vulnerability was her carefully maintained reputation. When she refused your final plea for mercy and reached for the telephone to contact the authorities, you revealed that you had already taken steps to expose her blackmail operation. For a woman whose entire identity depended on respectability, whose greatest terror was public humiliation, the shock was calculated to be fatal. Latimer's face remained impassive, but his hands trembled slightly as Miss Marple continued. After she collapsed from cardiac shock, you methodically staged the scene to suggest peaceful death during routine observation. You positioned her body in the chair, removed and folded her spectacles, arranged her hands with deliberate precision, and adjusted the chair's position to complete the illusion. The cruel irony was not lost on anyone present. Mrs. Vance, who had made systematic observation her life's work, had been destroyed by someone who understood her methods and vulnerabilities with professional precision. The resolution brought mixed emotions to St. Mary Mead's residence. Clara Jenkins, finally vindicated, found her relief tempered by the knowledge of how easily she could have been condemned for another's crime. Her brother's artistic aspirations, crushed by Mrs. Vance's withdrawn promise, were quietly revived through a discreet collection organized by Colonel Bantry and supported by several villagers who felt complicit in the near miscarriage of justice. Mrs. Finch struggled most with the revelations about her employer's true nature. 3 years I worked for her, never knowing what she really was, she confided to Miss Marple. All that careful attention to detail, all those telephone calls and filing systems, I thought she was simply well organized. To learn I was facilitating blackmail makes me feel complicit. You were deceived by someone skilled in deception, Miss Marple reassured her gently. Your loyalty was genuine, even if it was misplaced. That speaks well of your character, not poorly. Robert Vance's inheritance prospects, already complicated by his aunt's criminal activities, became further entangled in legal proceedings that would likely continue for years. His eager anticipation of wealth now appeared ghoulish in light of the circumstances, while his own financial difficulties raised uncomfortable questions about his relationship with his late aunt. The case forced an uncomfortable reckoning throughout St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Vance's generous contributions to village life, the restored organ, the cricket pavilion, the children's reading corner, were now tainted by the knowledge that they had been financed through systematic extortion. The comfortable assumption that wealth implied virtue had been shattered, replaced by a more complex understanding of human nature's capacity for both generosity and cruelty. The widow at the window sobriquet could not survive the revelations. Mrs. Vance's 3 years of careful observation were revealed as intelligence gathering for a sophisticated criminal operation that extended far beyond St. Mary Mead's boundaries. Her systematic attention to villagers' financial circumstances, their recent improvements and lifestyle changes, had all been part of a calculated strategy to identify potential blackmail targets. As the official proceedings concluded and the various participants dispersed to resume their disrupted lives, Miss Marple remained in the drawing room for a few moments, contemplating the scene where so much deception had been both practiced and finally exposed. The boarded window cast the room in subdued light, symbolic of how the truth had emerged from carefully maintained shadows. The tragedy, she reflected to Dr. Haydock, who had remained behind to ensure Mrs. Finch's emotional well-being, is not simply that Mrs. Vance was murdered, but that her systematic exploitation of others' weaknesses created the very desperation that led to her death. Mr. Latimer's crime was inexcusable, but it grew from soil that she had carefully prepared through years of calculated cruelty. The doctor nodded thoughtfully. And the village must now learn to trust again, despite having been so thoroughly deceived by appearances. Trust, but verify, Miss Marple agreed with a slight smile. The widow at the window taught us that observation without compassion becomes mere surveillance, and that secrets, when weaponized, inevitably destroy both victim and perpetrator. As she walked home through the September afternoon, Miss Marple reflected on how St. Mary Mead would heal from this revelation. The village's surface tranquility would eventually return, but beneath it would flow a deeper understanding of human nature's complexity. The comfortable illusions had been shattered, but perhaps that was not entirely unfortunate. Truth, however uncomfortable, was generally preferable to beautiful deceptions, and the community would emerge stronger for having faced the darkness that had hidden beneath its peaceful facade. The sparrows at her garden gate greeted her return with their usual enthusiasm, reminding her that life's simple pleasures remained constant despite human complications. She scattered their customary crumbs while contemplating the eternal mystery of why some people chose to nurture while others chose to exploit, and why the difference so often remained hidden until tragedy forced it into the light.